Hey guys, welcome to this module on CSS Flexbox. We're going to learn all about it, how it works, and how we can use it to create complex, flexible layouts using this CSS tool. As we mentioned, a lot of the web layout was originally inspired by newspapers and magazine articles, which is where all these display inline, display block, float all comes from. And over the years, the layout of the web has become more and more complex to the extent where it's no longer really that similar to a magazine. And a website has become far more complex and far more interactive. Over the years, there have been many ways of implementing HTML and CSS to lay out a website. One of the earliest ways was actually using HTML. We had these things called tables. So you could create a table element with table rows and table data to create something like this, a 3-column layout for your website. And if you set the width of these 3 columns to different amounts, then you can lay out your web page like this with 3 boxes or cards or whatever you like to call it. The table element is still very much in use in modern web design, but because it's in the HTML, it should really only be used when semantically you're actually trying to create a table. So in this case, if you were using this to represent some data, like, I don't know, how many car tires were sold on your website or how many visitors you had in May, then that is probably tabular data and should be represented with a table element. But if you're using table just to lay out the styling of your website, then this is very much a no-no in modern web design. And as you'll see, there are much better tools to do this nowadays, so you're not left in the dark. After people stopped using tables for layout, they started using what we've explored previously, which is using the display property. For example, you could set 3 divs to have inline block so that they'll all show up on the same line. And then if you set them to have a specific amount of width, then as long as there is enough for the entire horizontal, they will be stacked up next to each other like this in different columns. There are some problems with this though, because as you can see, the layout doesn't look great, right? Like, why are they not all on one line at the top? And in order to control this and move these blocks up and to have them all lined up, it's actually really fiddly and it's quite a painful process. And people have undergone this process just in order to have a specific styling that they want. You could, for example, use position absolute. So you could take these blocks out of the normal flow of HTML and instead have them be floating above the other content using absolute. And then with absolute, you can of course set the how much you want it to go from the left. And then this way you can set up a relatively complex layout, but it's a very inflexible layout because as soon as anything else gets added to this that's not absolute, say at the bottom, then you're going to have to fiddle around with it to get the right layout, and it's really not responsive and it's just not a great idea. But you know, if you have no other tools, then a hammer is going to do everything, right? But we do have other tools, and one of the most relied on tools in the sort of 2005 to 2010 era was using Float. And as we saw, Float is a very useful tool for floating images to get text to wrap around it. But people realize that you can actually use Float to create more complex layouts as well. For example, we could make all 3 of these float left so that they stack up next to each other. Alternatively, we could make something on the right float to the right, and we could have something float to the left. And as you saw before, we could clear a footer and use float and clear to basically create a more complex layout. And there are so many float related tips and hacks. For example, there's something called the clear fix hack, and there's different hacks to use float and clear to create complex layouts that you would want. But again, you know, it's kind of hacky and it's not that simple to reason about, especially when something goes wrong or something doesn't look quite right. It's really hard to fix. And I saw this a great thing on CSS Puns, which you can Google for, where they had this Titanic float none. That kind of describes how float is considered these days for complex layout. Don't use float for that. Float is great when you want to float an image to the left or the right of a block of text to wrap the text around it, but don't use floats for layout. Instead, use something else like what we're going to explore: Flexbox, Grid, Bootstrap, something that is designed specifically for creating an overall page structure. And within each of these blocks, you could continue to use your float and your clear, but we're keeping to the original intent of that tool. And we're not doing any sort of crazy hacks, because Flexbox is also incredibly easy to use. In order to create that layout that we've been coveting using all these different tricks and different hacks, with Flexbox, all you need to do is to wrap your divs inside a container, and then target that container in your CSS and set the display to flex. That's pretty much it. All you need to do in order to get them to be displayed in columns like this, as you would expect on a modern website. Now, it's also got these great additional properties, like, for example, gap, where you can add in a gap between each of these items. And there's a whole lot more that we're going to cover in this module. And you're going to see just how flexible and easy it is to use Flexbox to create more complex layouts on our website. Now, one of the things that you might realize at this stage is this flex is set on the display property. And we know that previously we've looked at display inline, display block, display inline block, and all of that, and display none. This particular set, I want you to think of it as a completely different system. When we're thinking about Flexbox, we have to throw all of this out of the window. That doesn't mean we're not going to use it, because as you see, websites still continue to use these different things. But when you make something flex, it no longer abides by any of these rules. Instead, it's a different system with different rules, and we have to learn about it and think about it as a separate entity. And essentially what happens when we declare something display flex is we give a little bit of the control to Flexbox to lay out our content in a reasonable and commonly desired way. But we have all of these different modifiers in order to tweak it to have the exact layout that we want. Again, just to reiterate, remember previously we mentioned that different elements by default have different display values. A div is by default going to be full width block. A span is by default going to be an inline element. Well, when you use Flexbox and you enclose all of the elements that you want to display inside a flexible container, then what happens is all of these previous display values will be ignored, and instead we're going to have everything laid out by Flexbox. And the width of each of the elements inside the Flexbox will normally be based on the content size. So it's going to try and let you have all of your content displayed in one line. And it doesn't matter what type of element you've got inside the Flexbox. It's going to apply the Flexbox rules to each of them. As we saw, we could use that property called gap in order to add a gap. So you could, for example, set it to be 10 pixels, which would be pretty static. Or if you want it to be more responsive, you could set it to 1 REM, which, remember from previous lessons we learned is a unit that is going to adapt based on the top level size of your content. By default, when you declare a container to be display flex, it's going to create a container that is going to be actually more or less like a block element. It's going to be 100% full width. But there's also this thing where instead of setting the container to be display flex, you can actually set it to be display inline flex. And similarly to the inline block, What it does is it allows this Flexbox to occupy as much space as it needs, but it means that other things can also go and occupy that same line. So this is just two different versions of creating a Flexbox container. So in this lesson, we looked very briefly at what happens when you set a container to be display flex. So now we're going to try an exercise and see if we've taken on some of the ideas that we've learned in this lesson. Go ahead and download the starting folder and extract it and open it inside VS Code. Select index.html and go ahead and show it in preview mode. You can see I've got a couple of different page layout methods that I mentioned in the lesson, and it's linked to in this home page. So I showed you how an HTML table would look like, and you can look at the code for that layout by going over to html-table.html. You can see we've set different values on the table data or the actual table itself and the different table rows, and we've created a reasonable sort of layout. And then you can see how we can create a similar layout using inline block, and how this is also more or less responsive. We've set different widths, but you can see how the layout is actually all defaulting down to squish at the bottom. And I want you just to explore some of these different ways of laying out content on a web page. Now, finally, I want you to take a look at flex.html and see how easy it was to create that layout and how few lines of code it actually required. Now, once you've done that, it's time for your challenge, which is to take the index.html page, which looks like this, and it's created using a whole bunch of list items. Now, I've gotten rid of the bullet points by setting list style to none, which you can switch on and off to see what happens. And this basically just gets rid of the bullet points, but I want you to turn this into a navigation bar. So I want everything to be on the horizontal. And if you take a look inside the goal image, this is what you're looking for. So you want all of these things to go up so that they are kind of laid out like this. You want to have a gap between them. You can set how big this gap you want to be. But essentially, this is the sort of outcome you're looking for. And I want you to do it using Flexbox. Pause the video now and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so this should be a relatively simple challenge. So we've got our preview on the right, and then we've got our index on the left. If you remember, Flexbox is declared on the container that contains all the elements that you want to flex. So in this case, we've got a div with a class of container that contains all the things we want. Let's go into this class selector and then go ahead and change the display to flex. And you can see almost immediately everything is now on the same line, looking pretty much like a nav bar that you would see out in the wild. The only thing we need to do is add a little bit of a gap between each of those items. So we could either add a 10 pixel gap, which looks pretty good, or you could use the rem system. If you don't remember what the rem is about, go back. There is a lesson where we covered font sizes where we talk about this in more detail. But no matter which way you do, you should be able to achieve this layout relatively easily. And if you want to take a look at the solution, you can see as well that the only thing that's really added are these two things in order to achieve this final goal outcome. Hopefully you managed to do that and you managed to see what declaring display as flex does to our HTML elements. And in the next lesson, we're going to dive deeper into Flexbox, and we're going to learn more about the Flexbox axes and the direction of flex. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there.